Big. That is the most descriptive word I know for Jim Blair. Big in stature, yes, but also the biggest thinker and the biggest heart I've ever known. Before I found him, I thought I had some pretty grand ideas. But Blair's plans were always on an enormous scale, far beyond what most people imagined. Of course, the law firm he helped build from a side partnership with a set of file cabinets and a $600 loan from Mom Blair is the ultimate example. He was so proud of what Linebarger, Goggin, Blair, and Sampson has become. Growing it over the years, he always loved to say, "I don't want to own the whole world. I just want the land that adjoins me." But my life with him is full of surprises and stories, like requesting him to buy a simple plug-on hose for the outdoor faucet so I could rinse off coming out of the swimming pool, and coming home to a 400-square-foot heated pool house with a sauna, steam, and of course, a sink with disappearing water because Jim Blair always had the coolest, latest gadgets. That was at 205 Grogan's Point, later known as the Blair House. He really wanted that house because it was the biggest. But over 10-plus years, our home held over 300 events for charity and political causes, with Blair greeting people at the door, usually in a top hat, for every one of them. Blair was a lawyer in his mid-40s, and I was a late-20s assistant county attorney when we met. Of course, many people understandably called it a midlife crisis that would never last. But that midlife lasted the rest of his life. He was bidding on the contract to collect Montgomery County taxes, and I was analyzing the competing firms for the Commissioner's Court and tax assessor. We first met on a phone call, and my thorough notes from that call say, "Telephone conference with Jim Blair for a very long time. He is so nice." But he couldn't answer any of my technical questions and said I should talk to his partner, Tommy Goggin. Our first face-to-face meeting was in court when I made the presentation recommending Hurd Goggin Blair for the contract. I left out the side door immediately after the presentation, and this huge man came chasing me down the hall, scaring me to death. He took me and my two bosses and Tommy Goggin to lunch that day and charmed me off my feet from the very beginning. Circumstances were that we really didn't keep in touch for a while. But as I learned very soon, and again over our time together, when Jim Blair makes up his mind, it's a done deal. His patient persistence and insistence meant that at some point, he would always get what he wanted. Once we started dating, he would drive to Conroe from his Houston office every day about lunchtime and park on the street outside my office in case I was available for lunch. Then he'd drive back to Houston, and then back to my home on Lake Conroe every evening, and then back home to Houston because I wouldn't let him stay overnight. For over a year, once a week, he would bake heart-shaped biscuits and ask me to marry him. And one day in 1991, I said yes, and he promptly whisked us away to Lake Tahoe to be wed on a cliff overlooking the lake by a preacher we found in the phone book with a limousine driver who was, thankfully, also a photographer. I agreed to move to the Montgomery County line, but no further, so we ended up in the Woodlands for nearly 35 years. Big thinker, big heart. That's Jim Blair. For example, when he first decided he wanted a wooden boat, our means covered a 16-foot runabout that he promptly named Little Nell. I should have known that when he fell in love with her, there would be more wooden boat mistresses in our future, including Miss Priss and ultimately the beautiful 57-foot Serenity. She was the same age as him, born in 1941. She's still a family member. But the thing is, his big heart was so generous in sharing everything he had, Serenity became his conduit to support causes that touched that heart. Auctioning cruises that he captained himself, Jim Blair and Serenity raised over $250,000 for charities. On another occasion, in a hotel room in Chicago in 2005, between Astros World Series games, which of course we attended, I was shopping online when I saw a photo of this vintage 1961 Rolls-Royce limousine that had once been owned by Red Skelton, one of Blair's favorite comedians. But no sooner had I shown him the photo, I found myself on a plane from Chicago to Atlanta to see this car that we did not need. He drove it once around the airfield, insisted that I write the man a check, and arrange for transport to Texas for arrival by the time we got home from the World Series. He loved that car, and it was just his size. And again, he was just as generous with it, chauffeuring many a bride to her wedding or displaying it for charity events. He concocted a plan for Valentine's Day each year. Instead of taking me to a crowded fancy restaurant for dinner, he would put on his chauffeur's hat and drive me around to my appointments all Valentine's Day. So I remember once he took me to the Wood Forest Bank and parked the Rolls limo outside on the curb. So the bank president, Robert Marling, came walking out to look at the car and was shocked to see his friend behind the wheel. "Blair," he said, "what are you doing here?" Jim Blair answered simply, "I'm just driving Miss Nell." His incredible generosity was truly the biggest thing about him. I now realize that God put us together basically so that I could manage his finances, so he could be as generous as he wanted. Otherwise, he would have run out of funds long ago. He was right with his Lord and had been baptized as a Christian early on, so regular tithing was a priority. But if a special need arose, his first thought was to write a check for the total. He didn't even know if there was money in the bank and didn't care. He felt the same way about children, particularly ones that might be hungry, or unsafe, or needy, or uneducated, or lacking in any way. And we know there are 1,000 other stories of Jim Blair's big-hearted generosity that many friends and organizations can tell about. Yes, Jim Blair always got what he wanted, and his entry into heaven was no different. He dictated his own terms, exercised a rarely used veto power that he had in our marriage, and finished his 81 years by answering the call of his Lord voluntarily and very peacefully. Who would have ever thought that a man who lives life as fully as Jim Blair would live to be 81? But I'm so grateful to God that he did. And our family is thankful for all the friends that are here today and for those that cannot be here as well, because we know you will always remember this big thinker, big heart, Jim Blair, who was in some way part of your lives too.